welcome. Something extraordinary waits for you here. A story so ancient, so layered, and so alive that it defies every ordinary measure of history. Imagine a civilization that was already building planned cities with covered drainage systems and standardized weights while most of the world still lived in scattered villages. Imagine that same civilization surviving invasion, transformation, fragmentation, and colonial subjugation across 5,000 years, and then emerging as the world's largest democracy, landing a spacecraft near the south pole of the moon. That is India. And that is the journey we are about to take together. This is not a summary. This is not a highlight reel. What you are about to experience is the complete story of one of humanity's oldest and most continuous civilizational experiments, told from the very beginning, from the Mesolithic rock shelters of Bhimbetka 30,000 years ago, through the silent, still undeciphered cities of the Indus Valley, through the fire altars of the Vedic world and the philosophical revolution that gave birth to Buddhism and Jainism, all the way to the Maurya Empire, the Gupta Golden Age, the Chola naval power, the Mughal splendor, the British colonial century, the independence struggle, and the democratic republic that stands today, with over 1.4 billion people and the fifth largest economy on Earth. We will walk through Mohenjo-daro's grid-planned streets and stand beside the great bath in polished brick. We will hear the hymns of the Rigveda composed on the banks of the Saraswati. We will follow Ashoka the Great as he surveys the carnage of Kalinga in 261 years before Christ, and watches his entire philosophy of power collapse into grief and transformation. We will enter Akbar's court at Fatehpur Sikri, where Hindu, Muslim, Jain, and Christian scholars debated theology in the same hall. We will stand before the Taj Mahal at dawn and understand what it cost to build it. We will ride with Gandhi to the shore at Dandi, watch Nehru raise the flag at the Red Fort, and witness Ambedkar hand the world's longest democratic constitution to a newly free nation. This story matters because India is not simply a country with a long past. It is a living argument, a continuous, unresolved, magnificent argument about how human beings can organize themselves across extraordinary diversity. Every border in South Asia, every religious tension, every democratic institution, every caste structure, every monsoon-fed agricultural rhythm, every Sanskrit-rooted word in a dozen modern languages carries the weight of this history. The choices made by Chandragupta, by Akbar, by the British East India Company, by Gandhi, by Jinnah, by Ambedkar, those choices still shape the lives of 1/5 of all humanity alive on Earth today. If you are drawn to complete journeys through the rise, transformation, and enduring legacy of the world's great civilizations, we invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Each exploration we bring you is a full passage through time, not a fragment, but a whole story, told with the depth and detail it deserves. Now let us step into that history, beginning with the land itself, the rivers and plains and mountain walls that made everything possible. Let us begin. Before there were borders, before there were names for rivers or words for kings, there was the land itself. The Indian subcontinent rises from the ocean floor of deep geological time as one of the most complete civilizational theaters on Earth. To the north, the Himalayas form a wall of ice and stone so vast that they generate their own weather systems, bending the jet stream, feeding the great rivers, and sealing the subcontinent into a world of its own. To the west, the Thar Desert stretches in silence, its dunes shifting with winds that carry no memory of rain. To the east, the Bay of Bengal receives the drainage of half a continent, and to the south, the land narrows into a long peninsula where two oceans meet, where the monsoon arrives each year like a returning tide, and where the rhythm of rain has governed human life for longer than any written record can reach. The Himalayas are not merely a boundary, they are a source. From their glaciers descend the Indus and the Ganges, two river systems that would become the twin spines of civilization. The Indus flows westward through what is now Pakistan, carving a broad floodplain across the northwestern corner of the subcontinent. The Ganges moves eastward through the great alluvial plain that stretches from the foothills of the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal, a plain so flat, so fertile, so vast that it would eventually support more human life than almost any comparable area on Earth. Between these rivers lies the Deccan Plateau, ancient, hard, volcanic, a raised tableland of black basalt and red laterite soil, where different ecologies and different peoples would develop in relative separation from the north. Along the coasts, narrow strips of tropical lowland connect the peninsula to the sea, opening routes of trade and contact that would reach Arabia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia long before any empire thought to map them. Into this landscape, human beings arrived in waves across deep time. The earliest traces of human presence in the subcontinent reach back hundreds of thousands of years. But it is in the rock shelters of Bhimbetka, in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, that the oldest surviving visual record of human life appears. Here, on the curved sandstone walls of natural caves, paintings survive from approximately 30,000 years before the present. Ochre handprints, running deer, dancing figures, scenes of hunting and gathering rendered with a directness that crosses all distance of time. The rock is warm in the afternoon light. The images are not primitive. They are precise, observed, alive. These were not isolated wanderers. The people who painted at Bhimbetka were part of a Mesolithic world of mobile hunter-gatherers who understood their landscape with extraordinary intimacy, its seasonal rhythms, its animal migrations, its edible plants, its water sources. They moved with the land rather than against it. The transformation came slowly. By approximately 7,000 years before the present, in the highlands of Baluchistan, at a site now called Mehrgarh, something new was taking shape. Here, at the western edge of the subcontinent where the Bolan Pass opens toward the Iranian plateau, communities were beginning to settle. They built rectangular mud brick structures. They stored grain in purpose-built pits. They cultivated wheat and barley. They kept cattle and sheep. They buried their dead with care, placing beads of turquoise and shell alongside the body, signs of belief, of exchange, of a world already more connected than it appears. Mehrgarh is among the earliest farming settlements yet discovered in South Asia. Its occupation spans thousands of years, accumulating layer upon layer of human activity, pottery becoming more refined, craft specialization emerging, the first fired ceramics appearing, and evidence of long-distance trade in materials that could only have come from distant regions. Cotton was cultivated here among the earliest in the world. Copper was worked. The settlement grew. This was not yet a city. It was not yet a state. But in the slow accumulation of Mehrgarh's centuries, the essential conditions were forming. Surplus food, settled community, specialized labor, and the exchange of goods across distance. The subcontinent was learning, in the most patient way imaginable, how to sustain and organize human life at scale. The first cities were still 2,000 years away, but the foundations were already being laid, grain by grain, brick by brick, in the shadow of the mountains where the rivers begin. 2,000 years passed between the first mud brick walls of Mehrgarh and the moment when something entirely new appeared along the floodplains of the Indus. When it came not gradually, but with the full force of an idea whose time had arrived, the idea of the city itself. By around 2,600 years before the Common Era, two great urban centers had risen on the banks of the Indus and its tributaries. Mohenjo-daro in the south, along the lower Indus in what is now Sindh. Harappa in the north, along the Ravi River in what is now Punjab. They were not the only settlements. Across a territory stretching from the foothills of Afghanistan westward to the coast of Gujarat, an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, more than 1,000 settlements have been identified by archaeologists. But Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were the great centers, each home to perhaps 40,000 people at their height, each organized with a precision that still astonishes those who study them. What the camera finds, hovering above Mohenjo-daro in reconstruction, is a city laid out on a grid. Streets run north to south and east to west, with a regularity that suggests not organic growth, but deliberate planning. The main avenues are wide enough for carts. The lanes between residential blocks are narrower, shaded, enclosed. Every major structure is built from fired brick, and the bricks, across the entire civilization, are standardized to the same ratio of length to width to height. A brick from Mohenjo-daro fits precisely alongside a brick from a settlement 500 miles distant. This uniformity was not accidental. It speaks of shared knowledge, shared authority, and a system of measurement that held across an entire civilization. Beneath the streets runs something even more remarkable. The drainage system of Mohenjo-daro is among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. Covered channels carry wastewater from individual houses into larger drains running beneath the main streets. Inspection holes allow for maintenance. Homes are equipped with bathing platforms and latrines connected to this network. The city was not merely planned, it was engineered for the management of water and waste in ways that most of the ancient world would not match for another 2,000 years. At the heart of Mohenjo-daro sits the Great Bath, a structure of particular mystery. It measures approximately 12 meters in length, 7 meters in width, and nearly 2.5 meters in depth. Its floor and walls are sealed with a layer of bitumen to prevent leakage. Steps descend from both ends. Around it stand rooms that may have served ritual or administrative functions. Whether the Great Bath was used for religious purification, civic ceremony, or communal gathering remains unknown. But its careful construction, its deliberate waterproofing, its formal architecture, suggests it held profound importance for the people who built and used it. The port city of Lothal, on the Gulf of Khambat in Gujarat, reveals another dimension of this civilization. Built around 2,400 years before the Common Era, Lothal contains what archaeologists interpret as a dockyard, a rectangular basin, roughly 220 meters by 37 meters, lined with fired brick and connected to a tidal estuary. Goods moved through Lothal by sea. Carnelian beads, copper tools, cotton textiles, and the distinctive stamp seals that served as the civilization's commercial signature. Those seals are among the most haunting objects the Harappan world left behind. Carved from steatite, square in shape, they bear images of animals: the humped bull, the rhinoceros, the elephant, the composite unicorn figure, alongside rows of signs in a script that has never been deciphered. More than 400 distinct signs have been identified. The language behind them remains locked. No Rosetta Stone has been found. The Harappans wrote, clearly and consistently, but what they wrote, their laws, their prayers, their commerce, their names, remains beyond reach. What is equally striking is what the Harappan cities do not contain. There are no monumental temples on the scale of Mesopotamia, no royal tombs filled with sacrificed servants, no massive palaces proclaiming the glory of a single ruler, no weapons caches suggesting a militarized state. The civilization appears to have organized itself without the apparatus of divine kingship that defined its contemporaries. How power was held, how decisions were made, how uniformity was enforced across such a vast territory, these questions remain open and perhaps unanswerable. Then, around 1900 years before the Common Era, the cities began to empty. The process was slow, a contraction rather than a sudden collapse. Populations shifted eastward toward the Gangetic Plains. The great drainage systems fell into disrepair. The standardized brick sizes disappeared. Climate records suggest a prolonged weakening of the monsoon. The Gaga-Hakra river system, which had supported dozens of settlements, appears to have dried significantly. The civilization did not end in fire or conquest. It dissolved quietly into the landscape that had made it possible, leaving behind its drains, its bricks, its silent script, and the deep question of what it truly was. What the Harappan cities left behind was not emptiness, it was potential, a subcontinent still rich in river water, dark soil and seasonal rain, waiting for the next chapter of organized human life to begin. That chapter arrived not with the sudden drama of conquest, but with the slow movement of peoples, languages, and ideas across the northwestern passes and into the broad plains beyond. By around 1500 years before the Common Era, a culture was taking shape across the Punjab and the upper Indus corridor that would prove among the most consequential in human history. These were the Vedic peoples, cattle-herding, fire-worshipping, hymn-composing communities who spoke an early form of Sanskrit and organized themselves into kinship groups called janas. They were not a single unified people arriving in a single wave. They were a gradual cultural presence, spreading eastward over centuries, absorbing and transforming whatever they encountered. At the center of their world was fire. The yajna, the sacred fire sacrifice, was not merely a ritual. It was a cosmological act, a means of communicating with forces that governed rain, cattle, victory, and life itself. On open plains, priests arranged bricks into precisely calculated altars. Clarified butter was poured into the flames. Hymns were recited in a language of extraordinary precision, Sanskrit, whose grammar would later be codified by Panini into one of the most sophisticated linguistic systems ever constructed. These hymns were not written down. They were memorized, syllable by syllable, and transmitted from teacher to student across generations with an accuracy that preserved them for 3,000 years. The oldest of these hymns form the Rig Veda, composed roughly between 1500 and 1200 years before the Common Era. It is one of the oldest surviving religious texts in the world, a collection of over 1,000 hymns addressed to deities of sky, storm, fire, and dawn. The god Indra, wielder of the thunderbolt and slayer of the serpent Vritra, stands at its center. Agni, the fire deity, mediates between the human and the divine. Varuna watches over cosmic order. These were not abstract philosophical concepts. They were living presences in a world where the monsoon's arrival or failure meant survival or death. The society that produced these hymns was organized around emerging distinctions of function. The Brahmin priests held sacred knowledge. The Kshatriya warriors led and protected. The Vaishyas herded cattle and traded. These early Varna categories were not yet the rigid hereditary system they would later become, but the architecture of social hierarchy was being constructed, hymn by hymn, ritual by ritual. As centuries passed, the center of Vedic life shifted eastward. The Gangetic plains, vast, flat, extraordinarily fertile, beckoned. And around 1,000 years before the Common Era, the tool that made their full transformation possible arrived. Iron. Iron-tipped plowshares could break the dense alluvial soil of the Ganges Valley in ways that earlier tools could not. Forests were cleared, fields were laid out, permanent settlements grew where seasonal camps had stood. The pastoral world of cattle-herding clans began its long transformation into an agrarian civilization of fixed villages, granaries, and territorial claims. Along the Yamuna and the Ganges, fortified mud-brick settlements appeared. The Jana, the tribal confederacy, began giving way to the Janapada, the territorial state with defined land and permanent governance. By 600 years before the Common Era, 16 of these great kingdoms and republics, the Mahajanapadas, had emerged across the northern subcontinent. Among them were Kosala in the northeast, Kuru along the upper Yamuna, Vatsa centered at Kaushambi, and Magadha in the southeast, anchored at the fortified city of Rajgir among its 5 encircling hills. Magadha's combination of iron resources, fertile land, and strategic position would make it the seedbed of the subcontinent's first great empire. But that transformation still lay ahead. For now the Gangetic heartland was a world of competing kingdoms, wandering teachers, and a civilization in the full, restless energy of its becoming. Into this world of competing kingdoms and restless philosophical inquiry, 2 figures emerged within a generation of each other, and between them they would redirect the spiritual and ethical imagination of an entire civilization. Vardhamana, who would come to be known as Mahavira, the great hero, was born around 599 years before the Common Era into a warrior clan in the region of modern Bihar. He renounced his household at the age of 30, spent 12 years in severe ascetic practice, enduring heat, cold, and silence, and attained what Jain tradition calls omniscient knowledge. His teachings formed the philosophical core of Jainism, that all living beings possess souls, that violence against any creature accumulates karmic weight, and that liberation requires radical non-harm, truthfulness, and the gradual purification of the self through disciplined renunciation. Mahavira died around 527 years before the Common Era, leaving behind a community of monks, nuns, and lay followers whose ethical commitments would shape Indian commerce, law, and philosophy for millennia. Within decades of Mahavira's awakening, another seeker sat beneath a pipal tree at a place that would become known as Bodh Gaya, in the heart of the Gangetic plain. Siddhartha Gautama, born around 563 years before the Common Era in Lumbini, in the foothills south of the Himalayas, had abandoned a life of royal comfort to understand the nature of suffering. Beneath that tree, in the stillness before dawn, he attained enlightenment. He became the Buddha, the awakened one. His first sermon, delivered in the deer park at Sarnath near Varanasi, set in motion what Buddhist tradition calls the turning of the wheel of Dharma. He taught the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, a middle way between extreme asceticism and indulgence, oriented toward the cessation of suffering through ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. The Buddha taught for 45 years, walking the roads of the Gangetic heartland, gathering a community of monks and nuns, the Sangha, that would outlast every empire of its age. These were not merely religious movements. They were philosophical revolutions that challenged the authority of the Brahmin priesthood, the efficacy of fire sacrifice, and the permanence of the Varna order. They offered liberation not through ritual but through understanding and practice, and they spoke in the vernacular languages of the people rather than in the sacred Sanskrit of the priestly class. Their appeal crossed social boundaries in ways that older institutions had not. While these teachings spread along the river roads, the political landscape of the Gangetic plain was consolidating with equal force. Magadha, already the most strategically positioned of the Mahajanapadas, expanded steadily under the Haryanka dynasty, and then the Shishunaga kings. By the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, the Nanda dynasty had seized power at Pataliputra, the great city at the confluence of the Ganges and Sun rivers, and built the most powerful military state the subcontinent had yet seen. The Nanda Empire commanded a vast standing army, a sophisticated treasury, and administrative reach across much of northern India. It was wealthy, feared, and deeply resented by the peoples it taxed. It was against this backdrop that a young Macedonian king crossed the Hindu Kush and descended into the northwestern subcontinent. Alexander of Macedon reached Taxila in 326 years before the Common Era, where he was received by the local ruler and encountered Indian philosophers, the naked ascetics his soldiers called gymnosophists, whose indifference to conquest and comfort unsettled even the conqueror's certainty. Alexander's forces crossed the Indus and pushed east, but at the Bays River his exhausted army refused to march further. The Nanda Empire lay just beyond the horizon. Alexander turned back, and within 3 years he was dead. His campaigns left behind Greek successor kingdoms in Bactria and the northwest, but the deeper transformation was already underway in the Gangetic heartland, where a young man named Chandragupta Maurya was watching the Nanda order and preparing to end it. Chandragupta Maurya was not born into power. He emerged from the margins, from a background that ancient sources describe variously, obscurely, as if history itself was uncertain how to account for him. What is clear is that by 321 years before the Common Era, guided by the relentless strategic mind of Kautilya, the Brahmin scholar and political theorist also known as Chanakya, Chandragupta had overthrown the last Nanda king and seized the throne of Magadha. The first empire in Indian history had begun. Kautilya's contribution was not merely tactical. His Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft, economics, and the science of governance, laid out a complete architecture of power. It described how a king should organize his ministers, deploy a network of spies, regulate markets, administer justice, and project military force. It was a cold, precise, and thoroughly pragmatic document. Where the Vedic tradition spoke of dharma and cosmic order, the Arthashastra spoke of control, information, and the mechanics of survival. Together, Chandragupta and Kautilya built not just a kingdom, but a system. The capital at Pataliputra, modern Patna, where the Ganges bends south, grew into one of the largest cities on earth. Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited the court of Chandragupta, described a wooden palace of extraordinary scale, surrounded by a moat, its pillared halls decorated with gold and silver. The city itself stretched for nearly 9 miles along the river, enclosed by timber walls with 64 gates and 570 towers. Megasthenes compared it favorably to the great cities of Persia. His account, preserved in fragments, offers the earliest detailed outside description of an Indian city. Chandragupta's empire expanded rapidly. He pushed northwest into territories left unstable by Alexander's withdrawal, absorbing the Indus Valley and the Punjab. Around 305 years before the Common Era, he confronted Seleucus Nicator, one of Alexander's successors, and forced a settlement that ceded vast territories in exchange for 500 war elephants. The subcontinent's northwest was now Mauryan. His son Bindusara extended the empire further south into the Deccan, so that by the time Ashoka inherited the throne around 268 years before the Common Era, Mauryan authority stretched from the Hindu Kush to the edges of the Tamil south. Ashoka's early reign followed the pattern of his predecessors. He consolidated power, suppressed rivals, and in 261 years before the Common Era launched a campaign against Kalinga, a coastal kingdom in what is now Odisha, that succeeded militarily and devastated him morally. Ancient inscriptions record that 100,000 people were killed, many more displaced, and that the sight of the suffering transformed the emperor. Whether this transformation was sudden or gradual, its consequences were permanent. Ashoka embraced the Buddhist principle of Dhamma, righteous conduct, compassion, non-violence, and made it the governing philosophy of his empire. What followed was unprecedented. Ashoka had his edicts carved into polished sandstone pillars and rock faces across the subcontinent, in Prakrit, in Greek, in Aramaic, so that his subjects and neighbors could read his commitments to their welfare. He built roads shaded by trees, dug wells at intervals, established hospitals for humans and animals, sent Buddhist missionaries to Sri Lanka, to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the West, to Southeast Asia. His lion capital at Sarnath, 4 lions seated back to back above a wheel of Dharma, became the emblem of the Indian Republic more than 2,000 years later. The Maurya system itself was a marvel of administration. Provincial governors answered to the emperor. A royal road ran from Taxila in the northwest to Pataliputra, with rest houses and distance markers. Standardized weights and measures facilitated trade across an empire of perhaps 50 million people. A vast intelligence network monitored officials, merchants, and potential threats. It was governance on a scale the subcontinent had never attempted. But empires built on personal authority are vulnerable to succession. After Ashoka's death in 232 years before the Common Era, the empire fragmented slowly. Weak successors, provincial rebellions, and pressure from the northwest eroded Mauryan power over the following decades. In 185 years before the Common Era, the last Maurya king was assassinated by his own commander, Pushyamitra Shunga, during a military parade. The first great Indian empire ended not in foreign conquest, but in the oldest of political failures, the collapse of the center from within. The assassination of the last Maurya king did not plunge the subcontinent into darkness. It opened it, fractured it into a mosaic of competing powers, regional kingdoms, and foreign dynasties that, taken together, produced some of the most remarkable cultural and intellectual achievements in human history. Fragmentation, it turned out, was not always the enemy of flowering. The Shunga dynasty that replaced the Mauryas ruled from Pataliputra for over a century, patronizing Brahmanical traditions and commissioning the great stone gateways of Sanchi, carved with scenes of the Buddha's life in a visual language of extraordinary richness. Meanwhile, in the northwest, the successors of Alexander's Bactrian governors had established Indo-Greek kingdoms that minted bilingual coins in Greek and Kharosthi script, blending Hellenistic portraiture with Indian religious symbolism. These were not mere curiosities. They were evidence of a subcontinent already in deep conversation with the wider world. From the northwest came another wave, the Kushana Empire, which by the reign of Kanishka I, around 127 of the Common Era, controlled territory stretching from Central Asia through the Gangetic Plain. Kanishka's empire was the great crossroads of its age. Along its roads moved silk from China, spices from India, glassware from Rome, and Buddhist missionaries traveling toward Central Asia and beyond. Taxila, the ancient university city, became a meeting point of Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Buddhist theology. The Silk Road was not a single road, it was a living network, and the Kushana Empire was its southern hinge. In the Deccan, the Satavahana kingdom maintained its own sphere, connecting the peninsula's interior to the ports of the western coast, where Roman merchants arrived seeking pepper, cotton, and ivory. Roman gold coins have been found across southern India in quantities that suggest trade of enormous scale. The subcontinent was exporting more than goods. It was exporting ideas, religions, and artistic traditions that would reshape civilizations from Rome to Southeast Asia. Then, in 320 of the Common Era, a new dynasty emerged from Magadha, the ancient heartland of the Mauryas. Chandragupta I founded the Gupta Empire, and within 2 generations it had expanded across northern India under Samudragupta, whose military campaigns a court poet compared to the conquests of the gods. But the Gupta achievement that endured was not territorial, it was intellectual. Under Chandragupta II, who ruled from approximately 375 to 415 of the Common Era, the Gupta court became the most sophisticated center of learning and art in the world. The poet Kalidasa composed the Abhijnana Sakuntalam, a Sanskrit drama of such elegance that later centuries would compare it to the finest works of any civilization. Aryabhata, working in 499 of the Common Era, calculated the approximate value of pi to 4 decimal places, proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis, and laid foundations for algebra and trigonometry that would eventually reach medieval Europe through Arabic translation. In the rock-cut caves of Ajanta in the Deccan, painters working by lamplight covered walls and ceilings with murals depicting the Jataka tales, the previous lives of the Buddha, in colors of lapis, ochre, and malachite that still glow after 15 centuries. The iron pillar erected in Delhi during the Gupta period stands today without a trace of rust, a testament to metallurgical knowledge that modern scientists have only recently fully explained. But the Gupta world carried within it the same vulnerability as every great empire before it. The Hunas, nomadic confederacies pressing from Central Asia, began raiding the northwestern frontier around 460 of the Common Era. By 530, repeated invasions had shattered Gupta provincial administration, emptied the treasury, and broken the network of roads and institutions that had held the empire together. The Golden Age did not end in a single catastrophe. It dissolved slowly, unevenly, leaving behind its mathematics, its poetry, its painted caves, and its rust-free iron as permanent marks on the world's memory. While the Gupta world dissolved into the northern plains, something ancient and self-contained continued to breathe in the south. The Deccan Plateau and the Tamil coastlands had never been fully absorbed by any northern empire. They operated on their own rhythms, shaped by different rivers, different monsoon patterns, different languages, and different gods. And from these southern foundations, some of the most extraordinary civilizations in Indian history quietly grew. The Sangam Age, stretching from roughly 300 years before the Common Era to 300 years into it, produced a Tamil literary tradition of startling sophistication. The three great Tamil kingdoms of this era, the Chera in the southwest, the Chola along the Coromandel coast, and the Pandya in the far south centered at Madurai, were not primitive chieftaincies. They were maritime powers embedded in a vast network of ocean trade that connected the Tamil ports to Rome, to Arabia, and to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Roman gold coins have been found in Tamil Nadu in quantities that speak to the scale of this commerce. Pepper, pearls, ivory, and fine cotton moved westward. Wine, gold, and glassware moved east. The port of Kaveripattinam, described in Sangam poetry as a city where the tide brought foreign ships and the streets smelled of fish and flowers, stood as one of the great commercial nodes of the ancient world. What makes the Sangam Age remarkable beyond its trade is its poetry. The Sangam corpus, over 2,000 individual poems composed by hundreds of named poets, including women, explored love, war, the sea, and the grief of separation with an emotional precision that feels entirely modern. These were not hymns to gods or kings alone. They were observations of the human heart set against specific landscapes, the mountains, the forests, the coastline, the dry plains, each associated with a particular emotional register. No other literary tradition of comparable antiquity in South Asia is so intimate, so secular, so attentive to individual feeling. After the Sangam centuries, the Pallava dynasty rose to prominence across the Tamil country and the northern Deccan, ruling from their capital at Kanchipuram. It was under Pallava patronage in the 7th century of the Common Era that the Shore Temple complex at Mahabalipuram was carved, not built, but carved directly from living granite boulders along the Bay of Bengal. The descent of the Ganges relief at Mahabalipuram is among the largest open-air rock carvings in the world, depicting celestial beings, elephants, and ascetics in a composition of extraordinary naturalism. The Shore Temple itself, rising in tiered stone above the waves, established architectural forms that would define South Indian temple design for centuries. The Rashtrakuta Empire then dominated the Deccan from the 8th to the 10th century, and it was under Rashtrakuta patronage that the Kailasa temple at Ellora was excavated, not constructed stone by stone, but hewn downward from the top of a single basalt cliff, an entire temple complex carved out of solid rock over generations of labor. It remains one of the most astonishing feats of human construction anywhere on Earth. But it was the medieval Chola Empire that carried southern civilization to its absolute peak. Under Rajaraja I, who ruled from 985 to 1014 of the Common Era, the Chola kingdom became an imperial power of the first order. His Brihadiswara temple at Thanjavur, completed in 1010, rises over 60 meters in a single granite Vimana tower. Constructed without mortar, its capstone alone weighing 80 tons, raised by ramps and human effort to a height that dominated the flat Tamil plain for miles in every direction. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a statement of sovereignty, a center of economic redistribution, and a living institution that employed hundreds of priests, dancers, musicians, and administrators. His son Rajendra I extended Chola power further still. In 1025, Rajendra launched a naval expedition across the Bay of Bengal, reaching the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, and the Strait of Malacca, defeating the Srivijaya maritime empire and securing the sea lanes of Southeast Asian trade. It was one of the most ambitious naval campaigns in medieval Asian history, projecting Tamil power across an ocean and establishing Chola prestige from Sri Lanka to the shores of mainland Southeast Asia. The Chola bronze tradition accompanied this imperial reach. Cast using the lost wax process, Chola bronzes of Shiva as Nataraja, the cosmic dancer encircled by a ring of fire, 1 foot raised, one crushing ignorance beneath it, achieved a perfection of form that has never been surpassed. These were not decorative objects, they were processional icons, carried through temple streets on festival days, dressed in silk and garlanded with jasmine, the divine made tangible in metal that still gleams after 1,000 years. While the Chola bronzes still moved through southern streets on festival days, the northern subcontinent was entering a transformation of an entirely different order. The world that had produced the Mahajanapadas, the Mauryas, the Guptas, and the fragmented kingdoms of the post-classical centuries was about to encounter a force that would permanently alter its political geography, its architecture, its administrative language, and the texture of daily life across the Gangetic plains. Muhammad of Ghor crossed the Indus with a disciplined cavalry army and a strategic patience that earlier raiders had lacked. At the Second Battle of Terrain in 1192, his forces met Prithviraj Chauhan, the Rajput king of Delhi and Ajmer, and defeated him decisively. It was not merely a military victory, it was a threshold. The political order that had governed northern India for centuries fractured at that moment, and what emerged in its place was something the subcontinent had not seen before. A sultanate rooted in Persian administrative culture, Islamic jurisprudence, and a conception of sovereignty drawn from the courts of Central Asia. The Qutb Minar rose from the Delhi plain beginning in 1193. Its red sandstone shaft, tapering through 5 stories toward the sky, was built using stone from demolished Hindu and Jain temples, a fact recorded without apology in its own inscriptions. The material continuity was visible in the carved brackets and decorative motifs that survived their recontextualization, Hindu stonework now framing Arabic calligraphy. The minaret was not only a call to prayer, it was a statement of arrival, of permanence, of a new civilization taking root in ancient soil. The Delhi Sultanate passed through 5 dynasties across 3.5 centuries. The slave dynasty, founded by Qutb-ud-Din Aibak, gave way to the Khalji dynasty, whose most formidable ruler, Alauddin Khalji, reigned from 1296 to 1316. Alauddin was a ruler of extraordinary administrative ambition. He imposed price controls on grain, cattle, cloth, and horses across his domains, a state market regulation system of remarkable complexity for its era, enforced through a network of inspectors and severe penalties. His armies repelled multiple Mongol invasions and pushed deep into the Deccan, extracting tribute from kingdoms that had never acknowledged northern authority. His capital at Siri, north of the original Qutb complex, added another layer to Delhi's expanding urban geography. The Tughlaq dynasty that followed produced Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a ruler whose intellectual ambition consistently outpaced his political judgment. He attempted to relocate the entire capital from Delhi to Daulatabad in the Deccan, forcing a mass migration of the city's population across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The experiment failed. The population returned. But the episode revealed both the ambition and the fragility of Sultanate power. His successor, Firuz Shah Tughlaq, built more carefully, constructing canals, hospitals, and colleges, and leaving behind the grey limestone fortress of Tughlaqabad as a monument to a dynasty that had overreached and contracted. Then came Timur. In 1398, the Turco-Mongol conqueror descended from Samarkand through the mountain passes and reached Delhi. What followed was not conquest in any administrative sense. It was devastation. The city was sacked over several days. Tens of thousands were killed. The Tughlaq court dissolved. Delhi, which had been one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the medieval world, was left depopulated and smoldering. It would take generations to recover. Into the political vacuum that followed, the Sayyid and Lodi dynasties attempted reconstruction. The Lodis, an Afghan dynasty, moved the center of gravity slightly, their architecture heavier, their political base different, but they could not restore the coherence the Sultanate had once possessed. Regional powers had grown too strong. The Deccan Sultanates, the Rajput kingdoms, the rising power of the Vijayanagara Empire in the south, all operated with increasing independence from whatever authority Delhi still claimed. Yet beneath the political turbulence, something quieter and more durable was taking shape. The Bhakti movement, a devotional tradition that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine over ritual hierarchy, spread across northern and central India through the voices of poet-saints who sang in vernacular languages that ordinary people understood. Kabir, a weaver from Varanasi who lived in the 15th century, composed verses that drew equally from Hindu and Islamic devotional traditions, rejecting caste distinctions and priestly intermediaries with equal force. His loom and his words occupied the same space, the everyday world of labor and longing. Mirabai sang of Krishna with an intensity that dissolved social boundaries. Ramananda taught across caste lines. These were not marginal voices. They were the sounds of a civilization metabolizing centuries of encounter and producing something new from the synthesis. When Ibrahim Lodi fell at the First Battle of Panipat in 1526, defeated by Babur's artillery and tactical genius, the Sultanate era formally ended. But its 3 centuries had permanently reshaped the subcontinent. Persian had become the language of administration and high culture. New architectural vocabularies had taken root. The population of northern India had become irreversibly plural in ways that no subsequent ruler could ignore or undo. Babur did not come to India seeking permanence. He came because Samarkand had been lost, because Fergana had slipped from his grasp, because the Central Asian world of his Timurid inheritance had refused to hold. What he found at Panipat on the 21st of April, 1526, was something he had not entirely planned for, a destiny larger than his ambitions. The battlefield stretched across flat agricultural land northwest of Delhi. Ibrahim Lodi commanded an army that outnumbered Babur's force many times over. But Babur had arranged his field artillery in a manner the Lodi commanders had never encountered. Cannons positioned behind wooden carts, flanking cavalry ready to encircle. When the guns fired, the war elephants panicked. When the flanks closed, the Lodi center collapsed. By afternoon, Ibrahim Lodi was dead among his soldiers, and the road to Delhi and Agra lay open. Babur entered Agra and found the treasury. He found a garden city along the Yamuna that he immediately began reshaping according to his Timurid aesthetic. Formal geometric gardens, water channels, symmetry imposed on the Indian river bank. The Baburnama, his memoir composed across these years in Chagatai Turkish, records not only battles and politics, but the birds of Hindustan, the flowers, the mangoes, he found strange at first and then remarkable. It is one of the most intimate documents left by any ruler of the medieval world, a man of genuine literary sensibility, recording a conquest with the eye of a naturalist. But Babur's India was fragile. The Rajput Confederacy under Rana Sanga challenged him at Kanwa in 1527. The Afghans of the east remained restless. Babur's own commanders wanted to return to Kabul, to the cooler air and familiar landscapes of Central Asia. He refused. He died in 1530, leaving an empire that was less a consolidated state than a military occupation of the Gangetic heartland, held together by the force of his personality and the loyalty of his commanders. His son Humayun inherited both the throne and its contradictions. Humayun was gifted, cultured, astrologically inclined, genuinely interested in art and philosophy, but inconsistent as a military commander. He allowed his brothers to hold autonomous territories that functioned as rival power centers. He moved slowly when speed was required. At the Battle of Chausa in 1539, Sher Shah Suri, an Afghan chieftain who had rebuilt the Sur tribal networks in Bihar, defeated him decisively. A year later at Kanauj, Humayun lost again. He fled westward across the Thar Desert, into Sindh, into Persia, where the Safavid Shah Tahmasp received him as a royal refugee. The decade of exile transformed Humayun. The Safavid court at Tabriz and Qazvin showed him what a fully realized Persian aesthetic looked like. The miniature painting traditions, the architectural refinement, the administrative culture of a sophisticated imperial bureaucracy. He returned to India in 1555 with Persian-trained painters and craftsmen, with a cultural vocabulary that would define the Mughal court for generations. He retook Delhi and Agra from the weakened Sur successors. Then, in 1556, he fell down the stairs of his library in the Purana Kila, stumbling as he heard the call to prayer, and died within days. In the years between Babur's victory and Humayun's death, Sher Shah Suri had done something the Mughals had not yet managed. He had governed. His Grand Trunk Road stretched from Bengal to the northwestern frontier, lined with rest houses and wells at regular intervals. His revenue system assessed land carefully and issued paper receipts to cultivators. His postal relay network moved information across the subcontinent with a speed that astonished contemporaries. The Mughals would inherit this administrative skeleton and build upon it, but the skeleton was Sher Shah's. Humayun's tomb, completed in 1572 by his widow, Haji Begum, stands in Delhi as the first fully realized Mughal architectural statement. A garden tomb set within a formal charbar, its double dome of white marble rising above red sandstone platforms, its Persian proportions announcing that something new had arrived on the subcontinent. It is the direct ancestor of the Taj Mahal. Standing before it, one understands that the Mughal project was always as much aesthetic as political, an attempt to make permanence visible in stone and water and symmetry, even as the dynasty itself had nearly dissolved before it truly began. Akbar was 13 years old when the weight of an empire fell upon him. The year was 1556, and the Mughal hold on Hindustan was not yet secure. A powerful Afghan general named Hemu had seized Delhi and Agra, declaring himself Raja, the first Hindu king to sit on Delhi's throne in centuries. At the Second Battle of Panipat, fought on the same ground where Babur had shattered the Lodi dynasty 30 years before, Akbar's regent Bairam Khan led the Mughal forces to a decisive victory. Hemu was struck by an arrow in the eye during the battle and captured. The empire that had nearly dissolved in Humayun's lifetime was reclaimed in a single afternoon. What followed over the next half-century was one of the most extraordinary exercises in imperial construction the subcontinent had ever witnessed. Akbar did not simply rule, he designed. He understood, with a clarity unusual in any ruler of any age, that an empire spanning the religious and ethnic diversity of the Indian subcontinent could not be held together by force alone. It required architecture, not merely in stone, but in law, in loyalty, in shared identity. The Mansabdari system was the skeleton of this architecture. Every military and civil official in the empire was assigned a numerical rank, a mansab, that determined salary, military obligation, and status. Ranks ran from commanders of 10 soldiers to commanders of 5,000 and beyond. Crucially, these ranks were not hereditary. They were granted by the emperor and could be revoked. This created a nobility bound to the throne by service rather than blood, dependent, loyal, and replaceable. Rajput chieftains, Persian nobles, Afghan commanders, and Hindu administrators all entered the same hierarchical framework. The system absorbed diversity and converted it into function. In 1564, Akbar abolished the jizya, the tax levied on non-Muslim subjects under Islamic law. It was a deliberate signal. The Mughal state would not govern through religious distinction. Rajput alliances followed, cemented through marriage and mutual interest. Akbar married into the royal house of Amber. Rajput commanders rose to the highest military ranks. Mansingh of Amber became one of the empire's most trusted generals. The subcontinent's Hindu majority was not merely tolerated, it was incorporated. The revenue system that financed this empire was rationalized in the 1580s under the finance minister Todar Mal. His survey measured agricultural land across the empire, classified soil quality, calculated average yields over 10 years, and set tax rates accordingly. The result was a system of remarkable precision, one that extracted revenue efficiently while reducing the arbitrary extortion that had plagued earlier administrations. peasants knew what they owed, the state knew what it could expect. The treasury filled steadily. Fatehpur Sikri, constructed between 1571 and 1585 in red sandstone on a ridge in Uttar Pradesh, was Akbar's attempt to make his vision visible. Its courts and pavilions blended Persian arches with Hindu brackets and columns. The Buland Darwaza, the Gate of Victory, rose 54 meters above the surrounding plain, its inscription acknowledging the transience of worldly power, even as the gate itself proclaimed imperial permanence. Within the complex, the Ibadat Khana hosted debates between Muslim theologians, Hindu pandits, Jain scholars, Zoroastrian priests, and Jesuit missionaries from Goa. Akbar listened, questioned, and refused to be confined by any single tradition. His atelier produced illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary refinement, the Akbarnama, the Hamzanama, the Razmnama. Persian and Indian painters worked side by side, developing a composite style that was neither purely Safavid nor purely indigenous, but distinctly Mughal. Music flourished at court. The musician Tansen, one of the 9 jewels of Akbar's court, composed ragas that entered the classical tradition permanently. When Akbar died in 1605, he left behind an empire stretching from Kabul to Bengal, from Kashmir to the northern Deccan, administered through a unified revenue system, held together by a nobility of service, and animated by a cultural synthesis that had no precise precedent on the subcontinent. The Mauryas had unified India through law and Buddhist ethics. Akbar unified it through inclusion, making the empire large enough to contain its own contradictions. That achievement would define, and eventually strain, everything that came after. The empire Akbar left behind was not merely a territorial inheritance. It was a living system, a vast administrative organism that required, above all, a ruler capable of sustaining its internal tensions. His son Jahangir, who ascended in 1605, was a man of extraordinary sensory intelligence and considerable personal weakness. He drank heavily, consumed opium, and surrendered much of the daily machinery of governance to his wife, Nur Jahan, whose political acumen was among the sharpest at any Mughal court. Yet Jahangir possessed something rare, an eye of almost scientific precision. His court painters were directed not merely to flatter but to observe. A dying bird, its feathers still iridescent, would be documented with the same gravity as a royal procession. The Tuzuki Jahangiri, his personal memoir, records his observations of animals, flowers, and human character with a directness that feels closer to natural philosophy than imperial autobiography. Under Jahangir, Mughal painting reached a peak of naturalist refinement that had no parallel in the Islamic world. It was also during Jahangir's reign that a small English trading delegation arrived at the imperial court. In 1608, the East India Company established its first presence at the port of Surat on the Gujarat coast. The company's representative Thomas Roe spent years at Jahangir's court seeking trading rights, and what he witnessed, the scale of Mughal wealth, the sophistication of the court, the volume of textile exports, made clear that England was dealing with a civilization of incomparably greater economic mass. The Mughals permitted the company's presence as a minor commercial convenience. Neither side could have imagined what that permission would eventually become. Shah Jahan, who seized the throne in 1628 after a brutal succession war, inherited an empire at the height of its material power and immediately set about expressing that power in stone and marble. His reign is inseparable from its architecture. The Taj Mahal, constructed between 1632 and 1653 as a mausoleum for his wife Mumtaz Mahal, remains the most recognized building on earth. 20,000 workers, white Makrana marble inlaid with semi-precious stones, a garden of geometric precision, and a dome that appears to float above the Yamuna River in the early morning light. The Red Fort at Delhi, completed in 1648, enclosed within its sandstone walls a city of marble pavilions, flowing water channels, and the Diwani cars, the hall of private audience, where the peacock throne stood. Constructed around 1635, at a cost estimated at 100 million rupees, the throne was encrusted with rubies, emeralds, pearls, and diamonds, its canopy supported by 12 emerald pillars. No piece of furniture in recorded history has approached its documented value. The wealth that produced these monuments was real and measurable. By the early 18th century, the Mughal Empire generated an estimated 25% of total world economic output, a share comparable to the entire European continent combined. Bengal alone exported more cotton textiles than all of England manufactured. The revenue system Todar Mal had designed under Akbar continued to function, channeling agricultural surplus into imperial coffers with bureaucratic efficiency. The Deccan campaigns under Shah Jahan extended Mughal authority southward, though never completely, against the resistant sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. Yet the very scale of the empire contained its fracture lines. Shah Jahan's four sons, Dara Shikoh, Aurangzeb, Shah Shuja, and Murad, each commanded armies and provincial revenues. When Shah Jahan fell gravely ill in 1657, the succession war began before he had died. Aurangzeb, commanding the Deccan armies, moved with ruthless strategic clarity. By 1658, he had defeated and executed his brothers, imprisoned his father in the Agra fort, and declared himself emperor. Shah Jahan would spend the last 8 years of his life looking from his marble window across the Yamuna toward the tomb he had built for the woman he loved. The zenith had passed. What followed would be magnificent in its own way, but the internal logic of the empire had already begun its long, slow turn toward exhaustion. Aurangzeb ruled from a court stripped of ornament. Where Shah Jahan had filled his halls with music and illuminated manuscripts, Aurangzeb removed the court musicians, dismissed the painters, and turned the ceremonial spaces of Mughal power into something closer to a military headquarters than a palace of culture. He was a man of genuine personal austerity. He copied the Quran by hand and sewed prayer caps to earn his own modest income, and he believed that the empire's accommodation of Hindu practice had drifted too far from Islamic principle. In 1679, he reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslim subjects, a levy that had been abolished by Akbar more than a century earlier. The political consequences were immediate and lasting. In the Western Deccan, a new power had already been rising for decades. Shivaji Bhonsle, born into a Maratha military family, had spent his youth studying the hill forts and river valleys of the Western Ghats with the eye of a commander. By the 1660s, he had carved out a sovereign territory through a combination of guerrilla tactics, strategic fort building, and fierce personal charisma. In 1674, he was crowned Chhatrapati, sovereign ruler, at Raigad Fort in a ceremony that deliberately invoked ancient Hindu kingship. the Maratha kingdom was not merely a military challenge to Mughal authority. It was an ideological one, a declaration that Hindu political sovereignty had not been extinguished. Aurangzeb spent the last 26 years of his reign in the Deccan, commanding an army that, at its peak, numbered hundreds of thousands of men, attempting to crush the Maratha Confederacy and annex the remaining southern sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. He succeeded in the latter. Both fell by 1687, but the Marathas proved impossible to destroy. Their cavalry moved faster than Mughal supply lines could follow. Their hill forts absorbed sieges that exhausted imperial resources. When Aurangzeb died in 1607 at the age of 88, the Deccan campaign had consumed the treasury, depopulated vast agricultural regions, and produced no permanent settlement. In the northwest, the Sikh community had been transforming under successive gurus. In 1699, Guru Gobind Singh founded the Khalsa, a disciplined brotherhood of initiated Sikhs bound by a common code of conduct and identity. The execution of his father, Guru Tegh Bahadur, by Aurangzeb's order in 1675, had already deepened the rupture between Mughal authority and the Sikh community. The Khalsa gave that rupture a military and institutional form that would eventually produce one of the most formidable armies in the subcontinent. After Aurangzeb's death, the empire did not collapse suddenly. It dissolved gradually, like a structure whose foundations have been quietly undermined. 12 emperors occupied the Mughal throne in the 50 years between 1707 and 1757. The Marathas expanded northward, extracting tribute from territories that had once been imperial heartland. The Nawabs of Bengal, Hyderabad, and Awadh governed their provinces as effectively independent rulers, sending nominal acknowledgement to Delhi while keeping their revenues at home. In 1739, Nadir Shah of Persia crossed the Khyber Pass with a disciplined army and defeated the Mughal forces at the Battle of Karnal. He entered Delhi and, following a massacre of the city's population in response to civilian violence against his troops, he systematically stripped the imperial treasury. The Peacock Throne, that extraordinary construction of gold, rubies, emeralds, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, was carried back to Persia. Delhi never fully recovered its status as a seat of genuine imperial power. By 1757, the Mughal emperor in Delhi was a figure of ceremony without authority. Real power in Bengal had passed to the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, who found himself in conflict with the British East India Company over their fortification of Calcutta. On the 23rd of June, 1757, at a mango grove near the village of Plassey along the Bhagirathi River, a company army under Robert Clive defeated Siraj's forces, aided decisively by the treachery of Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own commander. The battle lasted hours. Its consequences lasted centuries. The age of Mughal supremacy had ended. A new and entirely different kind of power had begun its ascent. What Plassey established was not merely a military victory. It was the opening of an entirely new political logic, one in which a commercial enterprise, chartered by a distant monarch and answerable primarily to its shareholders, would come to govern a subcontinent of hundreds of millions. Robert Clive returned to Bengal as governor, and the company moved swiftly to consolidate what the battlefield had delivered. In 1765, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. It was a formal transfer dressed in the language of Mughal administration, but its meaning was unmistakable. The company was now a sovereign power wearing the costume of a trading house. The revenues of Bengal flowed eastward toward Calcutta, and then westward across the ocean to London. Calcutta's docks filled with company ships, their holds carrying indigo, cotton, opium, and silk. The ledgers of the company's counting houses recorded the systematic extraction of wealth from one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. Contemporaries in Britain noticed the new fortunes arriving home. Edmund Burke would later call it plunder dressed as administration. The permanent settlement of 1793 formalized the land system that would define rural Bengal for generations. Lord Cornwallis fixed the revenue demand permanently with the zamindars, hereditary landlords who now held legal title to land in exchange for fixed annual payments to the company. The peasant cultivators beneath them had no such security. When harvests failed, the demand remained. The famine of 1770 had already killed an estimated 10 million people in Bengal alone, roughly 1/3 of the province's population, while company revenues continued to be collected. Beyond Bengal, the company's wars of expansion moved in every direction. In the south, Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who had modernized his army with French assistance and rocket artillery, and who understood with clarity what company expansion meant, fought 4 wars against British forces. His fortress at Seringapatam fell in 1799. Tipu died defending its walls. His death removed the last major southern power capable of sustained military resistance. The Maratha Confederacy, which had once threatened to replace Mughal authority across the north, was broken across 3 wars. The Third Maratha War ended in 1818, bringing the Peshwa's territories under company control. The Sikh Empire of Punjab, built by Maharaja Ranjit Singh into the most formidable military state in the northwest, survived his death in 1839 by only a decade. After 2 brutal Sikh wars, Punjab was annexed in 1849. The subcontinent, piece by piece, had been absorbed. The transformation was not only territorial. Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Education, written in 1835, argued that a class of Indians educated in English language and Western knowledge would serve as intermediaries between the company and the population it governed. English medium schools and colleges multiplied. The older traditions of Sanskrit and Persian learning were systematically defunded. The consequences for Indian intellectual life were profound and irreversible. Railways arrived in 1853, the first line running from Bombay to Thane. Within decades, thousands of miles of track crossed the subcontinent. The railways moved troops, raw materials, and revenue with unprecedented efficiency. They also destroyed the economic logic of local textile production. Lancashire mills, powered by industrial machinery, flooded Indian markets with cheap cotton cloth. The weavers of Dhaka, whose muslin had once clothed Mughal courts, found their livelihoods erased. The uprising of 1857 began among sepoys, Indian soldiers in company service, at Meerut in May, and spread rapidly across northern and central India. Grievances were layered. New rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat, the annexation of Awadh, the erosion of traditional privileges, and a deep unease at the pace of social change. Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur, and Jhansi became theatres of extraordinary violence on both sides. The company's reprisals were systematic and brutal. By 1858, the uprising had been suppressed. the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled to Rangoon. The last symbolic thread connecting the present to the Mughal world was cut. In August of 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company was dissolved. The Crown assumed direct sovereignty. 100 years after Plassey, the commercial enterprise had completed its transformation into an empire. The empire that replaced the company was not built on trade alone. It was built on certainty, the certainty of racial hierarchy, administrative order, and the civilizing mission that Victorian Britain had constructed to justify what was, at its foundation, an act of permanent extraction. When the Crown assumed sovereignty over India in 1858, it inherited not merely territory, but a system already deeply embedded in the subcontinent's economic and social fabric. What followed was not a new beginning. It was the formalization of a logic already in motion. The architecture of the British Raj was visible before it was felt. In Calcutta, the Victoria Memorial rose in white Makrana marble, a monument to imperial permanence, its domed silhouette commanding the Maidan like a statement of ownership carved in stone. Government buildings spread across Bombay and Madras in Gothic and Indo-Saracenic styles, their facades blending pointed arches with Mughal domes in a grammar that announced authority while borrowing local aesthetics. The railway network, begun in 1853, expanded rapidly under Crown rule, over 25,000 miles of track laid by the 1880s, connecting ports to interior markets, moving cotton and grain toward the coast, and manufactured British goods inward. The telegraph followed the railway. Irrigation canals spread across Punjab and the United Provinces. The Indian Civil Service, staffed overwhelmingly by men educated at Oxford and Cambridge, administered this vast system with a precision designed to serve the metropole. The cost was borne entirely by India. Dadabhai Naoroji, a Parsi intellectual and the first Indian elected to the British Parliament, calculated what he called the drain of wealth, the systematic transfer of Indian resources, revenues, and raw materials to Britain without equivalent return. Indian textile industries, once among the most sophisticated in the world, had been deliberately undercut by British tariff policies that flooded Indian markets with Lancashire mill cloth. The handloom weavers of Dhaka and Surat, whose muslin had clothed Mughal courts and European aristocracies, found their livelihoods destroyed within a generation. Famines struck with terrible regularity. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1879 killed between 6 and 10 million people across the Deccan and Madras, even as grain continued to be exported. It was within this context that the Indian National Congress was founded in Bombay in December of 1885. Its early sessions were orderly, deliberate affairs. Educated lawyers and administrators, many of them products of the very English-medium institutions Macaulay had designed, gathering under canvas tents to draft petitions and pass resolutions. Men like Gopal Krishna Gokhale argued for gradual constitutional reform within the imperial framework. The tone was moderate and the demands measured. But the conditions that produced the Congress were not moderate. They were the conditions of a people systematically excluded from the governance of their own land. The partition of Bengal in 1905 changed everything. Lord Curzon divided the province along religious lines, separating its Muslim east from its Hindu west, claiming administrative efficiency while fracturing one of the most politically conscious regions in the subcontinent. The response was immediate and electric. The Swadeshi movement swept Bengal and beyond, protesters burning British cloth in public squares, students and merchants pledging to buy only Indian-made goods, poets and journalists transforming economic grievance into cultural defiance. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, already a powerful voice in Maharashtra, pushed the Congress toward a more assertive nationalism, invoking the memory of Shivaji and the Vedic past as sources of political energy. The partition was reversed in 1911, but the wound it opened did not close. The Muslim League, founded in 1906, had begun articulating a separate political identity for Indian Muslims. The Lucknow Pact of 1916 brought Congress and the League into temporary alignment, with Tilak and Muhammad Ali Jinnah signing an agreement on separate electorates, a compromise that acknowledged the fracture lines already forming beneath the surface of nationalist politics. Then came Amritsar. On the 13th of April, 1919, thousands of unarmed civilians gathered in the walled garden of Jallianwala Bagh to protest the Rowlatt Act, which had extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire without warning. The garden had few exits. The firing continued for approximately 10 minutes. Estimates of the dead range from 379 in official British accounts to over 1,000 in Indian testimonies. The bullet marks remain in the walls today. No single event did more to transform Indian political consciousness. The massacre did not merely radicalize a generation, it severed the remaining thread of faith in imperial benevolence. The argument that British rule was, at its core, a system of organized violence could no longer be dismissed. A young lawyer recently returned from South Africa was watching. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and the world he would build from that moment forward would be unlike anything the empire had prepared for. Gandhi did not respond to Jallianwala Bagh with anger alone. He responded with architecture, the slow, deliberate construction of a mass movement unlike anything the colonial world had yet encountered. In 1920, at the Nagpur session of the Indian National Congress, he launched the non-cooperation movement. Its logic was radical in its simplicity. If the empire depended on Indian participation, Indian clerks, Indian soldiers, Indian lawyers, Indian consumers of British cloth, then the withdrawal of that participation would make the empire ungovernable. Thousands of lawyers surrendered their practices. Students left government schools. Titles and honors were returned. The spinning wheel, the charkha, became the movement's symbol, a deliberate inversion of industrial dependency, a declaration that Indian hands could clothe Indian bodies without Lancashire mills. The movement was suspended in 1922 after violence broke out at Chowri Chowra, where a crowd burned a police station and killed 22 officers. Gandhi called the suspension without hesitation. Discipline, he insisted, was not a tactical preference. It was the moral foundation of the entire enterprise. The empire had expected rage. What it could not absorb was organized, principled, non-violent refusal on a civilizational scale. The Salt March of March to April 1930 became the movement's defining image. Salt, taxed by the colonial government, monopolized by British administration, was the most universal commodity in Indian life. On the 12th of March, Gandhi walked from Sabarmati Ashram toward the coastal village of Dandi in Gujarat, covering 240 miles over 24 days. On the 6th of April, he bent to the shore and lifted a handful of salt from the sea. The gesture was simple. Its meaning was total. Across the subcontinent, millions followed. The colonial administration arrested over 60,000 people. The world watched. Jawaharlal Nehru, who had grown from a Cambridge-educated aristocrat into the movement's most articulate voice, spent much of this decade in British prisons. It was in those cells that he wrote his extraordinary work, The Discovery of India, a meditation on the civilization he was fighting to liberate. Nehru's vision was secular, modern, and pluralist, a republic that would contain all of India's diversity within a single democratic framework. His relationship with Gandhi was one of deep mutual respect and occasional tension. Gandhi looked backward to the village. Nehru looked forward to the steel plant and the university. Both understood that independence required both. Subhas Chandra Bose offered a third path. Impatient with non-violence, he fled British surveillance in 1941 and eventually reached Southeast Asia, where he organized the Indian National Army from prisoners of war captured by Japan. His forces fought under the banner of Azad Hind, Free India, and briefly crossed into Indian territory at Imphal and Kohima in 1944 before being repelled. Bose died in a plane crash in August 1945. His legacy remained fiercely contested. Revolutionary hero to millions, collaborator with fascism to others. The Quit India movement of August 1942 was Gandhi's most direct confrontation with the empire. The resolution demanded immediate British withdrawal. The colonial government responded within hours, arresting Gandhi, Nehru, and virtually the entire Congress leadership. The movement erupted into spontaneous, leaderless rebellion across the country. Railways were sabotaged, government buildings burned. The British suppressed it with considerable force, killing over 1,000 people and imprisoning over 100,000. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar was navigating a different struggle within the struggle. Born into the Maha caste, subjected to humiliations that Gandhi's movement did not always prioritize, Ambedkar argued that political independence without social transformation was incomplete liberation. He organized Dalit communities, challenged caste discrimination through legal and political means, and engaged in a famous debate with Gandhi over separate electorates for untouchables, a confrontation that produced the Pune Pact of 1932. Ambedkar's insistence that caste was India's deepest wound would eventually find its fullest expression in the constitution he would draft for the new republic. Muhammad Ali Jinnah had once been a committed advocate of Hindu-Muslim unity. By the late 1930s, he had concluded that unity within a single Indian state was impossible, that Muslims constituted a separate nation requiring a separate homeland. The Muslim League's Lahore Resolution of 1940 demanded the creation of independent states in the northwestern and eastern Muslim-majority regions. The two-nation theory hardened through the war years. The Simla Conference of 1945 failed to produce agreement. Direct Action Day on the 16th of August 1946, called by the League to demonstrate its resolve, triggered catastrophic communal violence in Calcutta, killing thousands in 4 days. The Attlee government, exhausted by war and unwilling to sustain an empire it could no longer afford, announced in February 1947 that Britain would leave India by June 1948. Lord Mountbatten, appointed as the final viceroy, accelerated the timeline. On the 14th of August 1947, Pakistan came into being. On the 15th, India. The transfer of power was complete, but the lines drawn by Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India before arriving to petition it, carved through Punjab and Bengal with catastrophic precision. 14 million people moved across borders that had not existed weeks before. Between 200,000 and 2 million died in the violence that followed. Trains arrived at stations filled with the dead. Lahore burned. Amritsar burned. And at the Red Fort in Delhi, in the early hours of the 15th of August, the Indian flag rose for the first time over a free nation. Ancient beyond measure, newborn in that moment, carrying the full weight of everything that had come before. The flag had risen. The nation existed. But a flag and a declaration were not yet a republic. What came next was something far harder than independence, the construction of a functioning democratic state from the ruins of colonial extraction across a subcontinent of 350 million people speaking hundreds of languages, practicing dozens of faiths, divided by caste, region, and the fresh wounds of partition. The question that hung over Delhi in those first months was not whether India would survive, it was whether India could govern itself. The man tasked with giving that governance its legal foundation was Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, a Dalit scholar who had faced discrimination at every stage of his life and had transformed that experience into one of the most rigorous legal minds of his generation. As chairman of the drafting committee, Ambedkar presided over the Constituent Assembly through nearly 3 years of deliberation. The document they produced, adopted on the 26th of January 1950, was the longest written constitution in the world, guaranteeing fundamental rights, abolishing untouchability, establishing universal adult suffrage, and creating a federal structure of extraordinary complexity. It was, in its ambition, a civilizational statement that a society shaped by hierarchy for millennia would now be governed by equality before law. While Ambedkar built the legal architecture, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was solving a different problem. At independence, 562 princely states, ranging from vast kingdoms to tiny estates, technically remained sovereign. Patel, as Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister, conducted one of the most remarkable feats of diplomatic consolidation in modern history. Through persuasion, pressure, and the occasional firm ultimatum, he integrated nearly all of them into the Indian Union within months. The map of India, which had been a patchwork of colonial districts and royal territories, became a single administrative whole. Hyderabad, which resisted, was absorbed by military action in September 1948. Junagadh followed. Only Kashmir remained unresolved, a wound that would not close. The first general election of 1951 and 52 was an act of faith on a scale the world had never seen. Over 170 million voters, the majority illiterate, were invited to choose their representatives through a system of symbol-marked ballot boxes designed specifically for a population that could not read candidate names. The Indian National Congress, under Jawaharlal Nehru, won decisively. Democracy had not merely been declared, it had been practiced. Nehru's vision for India was developmental and secular. He believed that steel plants and hydroelectric dams were the instruments of liberation, that industrialization would free India from the poverty that colonialism had deepened. The Bhakra Nangal Dam on the Sutlej River, the Bokaro and Bhilai steel plants, the Indian Institutes of Technology, these were what Nehru called the temples of modern India. 5-year plans, modeled partly on Soviet planning but adapted to a democratic framework, directed investment into heavy industry and infrastructure. The results were real, if uneven. Industrial capacity grew, but agriculture lagged, and the rural poor remained largely untouched by the new economy. On the world stage, Nehru became the architect of the non-aligned movement, the effort to carve a path between the American and Soviet blocs during the Cold War. At the Bandung Conference of 1955, he stood alongside Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Zhou Enlai of China as a voice for the newly decolonized world. India's moral authority in those years was genuine, but it rested on assumptions about international relations that would prove fragile. In October 1962, Chinese forces crossed the McMahon Line in the northeast and advanced rapidly through terrain that Indian troops were unprepared to defend. The Sino-Indian War lasted less than a month before China declared a unilateral ceasefire, having made its point. The defeat shattered Nehru's belief that friendship between Asian nations could substitute for military preparedness. He never fully recovered. His health declined through 1963, and on the 27th of May 1964, Jawaharlal Nehru died in office, the only prime minister independent India had ever known. The republic he had helped build was 17 years old, imperfect, contested, and alive. Nehru's death left a vacuum that the Congress Party filled cautiously. Lal Bahadur Shastri, a quiet man of modest origins, became Prime Minister in June 1964. He governed without spectacle, but history would not grant him peace. In August 1965, Pakistani forces crossed the ceasefire line in Kashmir, initiating a war that spread to the Punjab plains within weeks. Indian armor pushed toward Lahore. The fighting was intense, inconclusive, and costly on both sides. A Soviet-brokered ceasefire produced the Tashkent Declaration in January 1966. Shastri signed it and died of a heart attack that same night, a second prime minister lost within 2 years. What followed was the rise of Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, whom Congress elders believed they could manage. They were wrong. She outmaneuvered her rivals, split the party in 1969, nationalized the banks, and built a political identity around poverty alleviation and direct connection with India's rural poor. Her slogan, "Remove Poverty," swept her to a massive parliamentary majority in 1971. Within months, she faced a crisis that would define her legacy. In East Pakistan, the Bengali-speaking population had voted overwhelmingly for the Awami League under Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The Pakistani military responded with a campaign of brutal suppression in March 1971. Millions of refugees poured across the border into India. Indira Gandhi recognized the moment. Indian forces trained and supplied the Mukti Bahini resistance fighters through the year. In December 1971, after Pakistani aircraft struck Indian airfields, India entered the war directly. The Indian army crossed the Brahmaputra and advanced on Dhaka. Pakistani forces surrendered on December 16, 1971. 93,000 soldiers, the largest military surrender since the Second World War. Bangladesh was born. It was the clearest military victory independent India had ever achieved. The Green Revolution, already underway through the 1960s with high-yield wheat varieties developed by agronomist Norman Borlaug and implemented through Indian agricultural scientists, had by the early 1970s transformed Punjab and Haryana into grain surpluses. Famine, which had stalked India for centuries, retreated, but political pressures accumulated. In May 1974, India detonated its first nuclear device beneath the Rajasthan desert at Pokhran, codenamed Smiling Buddha. India had entered the nuclear age without signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The following year brought something darker. In June 1975, facing a court ruling that invalidated her election on grounds of electoral malpractice, Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency. Civil liberties were suspended. Opposition leaders were imprisoned. The press was censored. Newspapers arrived with blank columns where editors had refused to print approved content. Forced sterilization programs were implemented in the name of population control. For 21 months, India's democracy was suspended from within. When Indira called elections in March 1977, believing she would win, the electorate rejected her decisively. The Janata Party coalition formed India's first non-Congress government. The Janata experiment collapsed within 2 years under the weight of coalition rivalries. Indira returned to power in 1980, but Punjab was burning. Sikh separatists demanding the independent state of Khalistan had fortified the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar under the militant preacher Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. In June 1984, Indira ordered Operation Blue Star. The Indian army entered the holiest shrine in Sikhism. The Akal Takht was shattered by tank fire. Hundreds died. The sacred complex was desecrated in the eyes of millions. On October 31, 1984, Indira Gandhi was assassinated by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards in her garden in New Delhi. Anti-Sikh pogroms erupted across northern India. Thousands were killed in days. Her son Rajiv Gandhi inherited power in a moment of grief and violence. Young, modernizing, and politically inexperienced, he won a landslide election on sympathy and began pushing India toward computers and telecommunications. But corruption scandals, the Bofors arms deal, and the mishandling of the Sri Lankan Civil War eroded his government. He lost the 1989 election. By 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves had fallen to barely 2 weeks of import cover. The economy stood at the edge of default. Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, presenting the budget in July 1991, dismantled the license Raj, the dense web of permits and controls that had strangled Indian enterprise for decades. Tariffs fell. Foreign investment was invited. State monopolies cracked open. It was not merely a budget. It was the end of one India and the beginning of another. The reforms of 1991 did not transform India overnight. Change moved through the country the way monsoon moves across the subcontinent, unevenly, with dry patches and sudden floods, leaving some regions saturated and others barely touched. But the direction was irreversible. The license Raj, that vast bureaucratic architecture of permits, quotas, and state controls, had been cracked open, and through that crack poured something the Indian economy had not experienced in decades: momentum. Bangalore felt it first. In the early 1990s, the city's mild climate, English-speaking engineering graduates, and existing defense research infrastructure made it the natural home for India's software industry. Glass campuses rose along the outer ring road. Companies like Infosys, founded by Narayana Murthy, and Wipro, led by Azim Premji, built global businesses from Indian soil, writing code for American banks and European corporations. Hyderabad followed. By the early 2000s, India was processing the world's data, managing its call centers, and running its back-office operations. Information technology exports grew from negligible figures to over $50 billion annually within 2 decades. A new middle class emerged, urban, aspirational, connected to global culture in ways no previous Indian generation had been. But prosperity and violence moved together through these years. On December 6, 1992, a mob assembled at Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh and demolished the Babri Masjid, a 16th-century mosque built on a site that Hindu nationalists claimed as the birthplace of the god Ram. The demolition triggered riots across India and Pakistan. In Bombay, later renamed Mumbai, communal violence killed over 900 people in January 1993. The wounds cut deep into the fabric of Indian pluralism, reopening questions about the Republic's secular foundations that had never been fully resolved since partition. The nuclear question had also never been resolved. In May 1998, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee of the Bharatiya Janata Party authorized a series of underground nuclear tests at Pokhran in the Thar Desert. 5 detonations between May 11th and 13th, codenamed Operation Shakti. India declared itself a nuclear weapons state. Pakistan responded with its own tests within weeks. The international community imposed sanctions. Vajpayee called it an act of self-defense. Critics called it a dangerous escalation. The subcontinent, already partitioned by history, was now divided by nuclear arsenals. The following year brought war. In the spring of 1999, Pakistani soldiers and militants crossed the line of control in the Kargil district of Jammu and Kashmir, occupying strategic heights above the Srinagar-Leh highway. The Indian Army fought upward through thin mountain air and heavy fire to reclaim those peaks through the summer. Over 500 Indian soldiers died. The Kargil War ended in Indian military success and Pakistani withdrawal, but it deepened the subcontinent's unresolved territorial wound. The 2000s brought growth and grief in equal measure. India's gross domestic product expanded at roughly 8% annually through much of the decade. The 2008 United States-India nuclear deal formalized India's status as a responsible nuclear power outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty framework. The space program advanced steadily. The Chandrayaan-1 lunar orbiter launched in October 2008, detecting water molecules on the moon's surface. Yet on November 26th of that same year, 10 gunmen landed by sea in Mumbai and attacked the Chhatrapati Shivaji terminus, the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, and other sites across the city over 3 days, killing 166 people. The attacks, traced to the Pakistan-based Lashkar-e-Taiba organization, froze diplomatic progress between the two nations for years. The United Progressive Alliance government of Manmohan Singh, which had presided over India's fastest growth years, stumbled badly in its second term after 2009. Corruption scandals, the two-generation spectrum allocation controversy, the Commonwealth Games procurement failures eroded public trust. Growth slowed, inflation rose. A vast civil society movement led by activist Anna Hazare in 2011 demanded anti-corruption legislation and captured the nation's attention. By 2014, the electorate was ready for something new. The India that went to the polls that spring was wealthier, more connected, more impatient, and more politically charged than any India that had voted before. What it chose would define the next decade. Narendra Modi arrived in New Delhi in May 2014, carrying the largest parliamentary majority any Indian government had won in 30 years. The Bharatiya Janata Party held 282 seats in the lower house alone, a mandate that felt to its supporters like a civilizational correction, and to its critics like the beginning of an uncertain transformation. Modi himself was a figure unlike any previous prime minister, a man of lower caste origin from Gujarat, a lifelong party organizer, a relentless communicator who understood the grammar of the new digital India better than any politician before him. The first years brought ambitious programs: the Swachh Bharat sanitation campaign, the Jan Dhan financial inclusion drive that opened hundreds of millions of bank accounts, and the Make in India manufacturing initiative. Then, in November 2016, came the most dramatic economic intervention since liberalization. Overnight, the government withdrew 86% of all currency in circulation, declaring 500 and 1,000 rupee notes invalid. Demonetization, as it was called, sent hundreds of millions of people into bank queues, stretching across cities and villages alike. The stated goals, eliminating black money, pushing India toward a cashless economy, were debated fiercely. The disruption was immediate and real. The long-term verdict remained contested. In July 2017, the Goods and Services Tax unified India's fractured indirect tax system into a single national framework for the first time, a reform economists had debated for 2 decades. In August 2019, the government abrogated Article 370 of the Constitution, stripping Jammu and Kashmir of its special autonomous status and reorganizing it into 2 union territories, administered directly from New Delhi. The move was celebrated by Hindu nationalists as a restoration of national integrity and condemned by critics as a dismantling of constitutional protections. The Citizenship Amendment Act of the same year, which offered a pathway to citizenship for religious minorities from neighboring countries while excluding Muslims, triggered the largest street protests India had seen in a generation. Then the pandemic arrived. In March 2020, India imposed one of the world's strictest lockdowns with 4 hours of notice, a decision that left millions of migrant workers stranded on highways, walking hundreds of kilometers toward home. The images recalled, in their scale of displacement, older and darker chapters of the subcontinent's history. India's vaccination campaign, once it accelerated, became one of the largest in human history, administering over 2 billion doses by 2022. Through all of this, something else was happening quietly in the southern city of Bengaluru and in the laboratories of the Indian Space Research Organization. On August 23, 2023, a spacecraft named Chandrayaan-3 touched down near the south pole of the Moon, a region no nation had ever reached. India became the 4th country in history to land on the Moon, and the first to reach its southern pole, where water ice is believed to exist. The control room erupted. Scientists wept. Across 1.5 billion screens, a nation watched a machine built by its own engineers settle gently onto another world. That same year, India surpassed China to become the world's most populous nation. 1,400,000,000 people, the largest human community on Earth, governed under a single democratic framework. In September 2023, New Delhi hosted the Group of 20 Summit, and Modi sat at the center of a gathering of the world's largest economies as the host of a civilization that had been receiving foreign visitors for 5,000 years. The new Parliament building, inaugurated in May 2023, was built in a triangular form, drawing on ancient Indian architectural traditions. Inside its central hall, the Ashokan lion capital, the same emblem that Ashoka placed atop his pillars in the 3rd century before the Common Era, looked down over the proceedings of the world's largest democracy. The same symbol appears on every Indian passport, every rupee coin, every official document of the Republic. It is perhaps the longest unbroken thread in the story of any living nation on Earth. From the fired bricks of Mohenjo-daro to the rocket engines of Chandrayaan, from the edicts of Ashoka to the arguments of Ambedkar, from the monsoon-fed plains of the Ganges to the server farms of Bengaluru, India has never been a finished thing. It has always been a process, vast, contradictory, unresolved, and alive. That is not a weakness. It is the oldest and most honest definition of civilization itself. Thank you for traveling through 5,000 years of this extraordinary story. If this series moved you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.